What does the Bible really say about gender, sexuality, and marriage? From the surface understanding, this may seem like a trivial question. Dive a little deeper, and you may be surprised with what you find. Welcome, everyone. My guest today is Dr. Jennifer Bird, who is a New Testament Bible scholar, educator, author, and I like to describe her as a human rights advocate. Her work often ruffles the feathers of many fundamentalists, not because her ideas are wild or unfounded, but because she approaches her scholarship as a thinking, feeling human. Her work is known world over, with reviewers thanking her for her honesty, objectivity, and illumination of difficult concepts within the Bible. Dr. Jennifer Bird is an educator of over 20 years with a Master's of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary and a PhD in New Testament and Early Christianity from Vanderbilt University. She has quickly become one of my favorite Christian authors and has introduced me to what is now one of my favorite quotes, which is a paraphrase from Aristotle that is, "It is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain an idea without accepting it." I hope we can all absorb this advice. Welcome, Dr. Jennifer Bird.
Hello, David. Thank you for having me. That was such a lovely intro. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I try to do my guests, honor my guests in the introduction, and
Yeah,
I think there's more that could be said about you, but I want to keep it kind of short. But
that's
it's
sweet.
I've only met you and kind of learned about your work through Derek and
Yeah,
through Dr. Josh when
the
doing
panel
the
we're doing
panel.
next week.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been
So
fun for me to be a part of all of this and also to get to meet you. Just really appreciate where you're coming from and what you bring to the conversations. So
yeah, well, I'm kind of the it's funny, we're all in a group chat and you guys are all like scholars and I'm there saying like silly things and no one cares.
well, and
You
I
guys are all talking about stuff and I'm like, and I'll just like throw like a little witticism out there and everyone's just like, okay, and then just kind of keeps
no,
moving.
but it is. I do feel badly because in like scholarly or intellectual humor can be kind of odd, the little
Yeah.
inside joke kind of
Yeah.
anyway. Yeah.
I
But
I I'm trying to get people to, like I try and there's with me there's like a point where people go, all right, Dave is weird, like they're like, Dave's weird, he's a weird guy, but then eventually like it crosses over and like, okay, he's funny as well because
yes,
he's saying
yes.
enough funny things now. So what are we drinking today?
Um, I uh, coffee. I'm a strong dark
Yeah.
coffee person. I do put a little sugar and cream in there, half and half. I don't know about what's your way to drink coffee, David?
I'm just like, well, normally I do an iced coffee, so
Mhm.
but it's just instant. So I just throw instant in there,
Okay.
ice, and then like add hot water and then add soy milk or oat milk or something like that.
Yeah. Nice.
Is what I like to do.
Okay.
um I wouldn't normally do this, but we've just guys, I just want to also shout out, we've just been monetized, which was something that we pushed very hard to get monetized so that we could get super chats during the slavery panel, which is coming up. And we just had our first super chat, so I had to shout out to ChatGDP.
Yes, and I love
Thank you for standing up for LGBT people, Dr. Bird.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. You're welcome.
So you are the first super chat I've ever received, so thank
How
you so
exciting.
much. That's very
Yeah.
exciting. So so how would you like how would you like me to refer to you, Dr. Jennifer Bird? Jennifer, how's
Jen or Jennifer works for me.
okay?
I appreciate
Jen,
your
okay.
respectfulness,
Professor
but yeah.
Jennifer, no. So Jennifer, tell us about going on dates with Jesus.
I do pull back from the microphone when I laugh because I have a really
Yeah,
bad
yeah.
laugh.
No, so do I do as well.
Yeah, right. That is funny that you opened with that. So yes, I had a very conservative, like fundamentalist swing, much to my family's whatever. They tell, I think they just kind of put up with me or whatever. But yeah, I thought of myself as dating Jesus when I was in college, especially my first couple years. I remember going to this donut shop that I just loved, freshman, first and second year college. And I just go get a couple donuts and a cup of coffee and I just hang out in a booth and I would reflect on, it was almost like having a devotional or a quiet time or whatever, if that language means anything to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would, converse with Jesus in my mind, and
No, I know what you mean. It sounds funny to say dating Jesus. So was it like a thing that you and like your other Christian friends, like you would all do separately? Like it was like a thing? Like
Yeah, I was kind of a superstar because I would do that. Like others would like think that was impressive that I would, but they didn't have like the courage or whatever to actually think about it that way or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm being silly, but yeah, we did. I had friends who thought of it that way, and the whole 9 yards that goes along with a very conservative, fundamentalist kind of a evangelical community. No kissing until you're married, that kind of thing, like kissing for
Yeah,
the first
wow.
time on your wedding day in front of
Yeah.
everybody. How weird is that? But people did
Yeah,
it.
that would be bizarre. I
Right?
mean, I know people who did it as well in the church.
Uh-huh. Mhm.
But there's I remember when I first, so I mentioned beforehand I used to be a Christian, a Pentecostal youth pastor, and now I'm no longer a Christian, but I try to be
Mhm.
yeah, we did the speaking in tongues, all the good stuff.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I remember listening to worship music when I first became a Christian, and it was, Jesus, we love you, and all that stuff, and I was like, oh, that's cool. But there was this one song that was by Planet Shakers that was like, it says like, Jesus, I'm in love with you. And I
Mhm.
was like, the in love. And I was like, and I remember I was riding my push bike to work at the supermarket.
Nice.
And I remember thinking to myself, oh, that's too far. I was like, that's in love with Jesus.
2
That
steps
feels too far. But then, sure enough, give me a few more months in the church, and I was like, I'm in love with you, Jesus. Like it became like I totally flipped my script on that. It was a cool thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Which that raises all these other thoughts for me or other topics or, like the whole issue of the way the church over the centuries has talked about romantic or intimate relationships and what's allowed and what's not, I mean, to have a male saying he's in love with Jesus, right? I mean, that's a conversation to have, right?
Yeah. So you went from having coffees with Jesus and to being against women ordination, right? So you went from that to what you're doing today, which you're definitely the authority in this conversation, let me tell you. So you definitely have authority over me in this situation. So how did you go from being against women ordination and not liking women pastors, that concept, to moving to how you think today?
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I should also note that I grew up in the United Methodist Church, and in our area, there were plenty of women who are associate pastors, at least, and now more and more head pastors as well. But even growing up, I had two of my favorite people, and I'm still in touch with them. Actually, just reconnected with them last year. Were the female associate pastors, in these churches, and they were, so as a growing up, even as a young teenager, I loved them and I had no trouble with it. And it was when I started reading the Bible much more, I'm going to put in air quotes literally, because sometimes people think they're reading these stories literally and they're actually reading them metaphorically or spiritually. And so relatively speaking, it's a whole conversation there. But relatively speaking, it was much more literal, taking it, kind of at face value, and God's word has to trump everything else. So that's how I went from being a member of a Methodist church to saying, no, I actually am not okay with these things. Even on my mother's ordination day, she was ordained I think in her 50s. Early 50s. Yeah. And on her ordination day, I, asked her how she could do this because it's against God's will,
Wow.
And then, yes. And then now I'm kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum, if you will. And how did I go from there to where I am? Primarily, intellectual integrity.
Yeah.
And that's it. Like, I went to seminary because I wanted to learn biblical languages. And the reason I wanted to do that was someone had shown me that they were working with the Greek in the Mary Martha story, for anyone who's familiar with that story. And she changed the way she kind of interpreted what he says to Martha. And it rocked my world. Like, in one of the most dramatic ways, it's one of the most dramatic moments of my life, actually, was having this paper that was showing me something different. And I was like, if this one thing attributed to Jesus can be translated differently because you know the languages, I want in on that. Like, what else am I missing? Right? What else could I? And the scripture was important to me. And so that's, I went to seminary to learn the languages, and then I didn't know I was going to be exposed to all the other stuff, the church history and where the theology came from and the development of it all. And, I probably wouldn't have gone if I'd known what I was going to be exposed to.
I know what you mean.
Do you know what I mean?
What you mean. Yeah, it's funny because I can see a lot of similarities in your journey to my journey. When I was reading your book, I saw that I was a bit the same. Obviously, mine led me in very different direction to yours.
Sure.
In the end.
Yeah.
But which is fine. I'm not judging anyone, and I hope you're not judging me. But
no.
But what's interesting is, like, I remember thinking to myself, like, learning about like science and learning about fossils and the fossil record and evolution and things like that when I was looking into things. And I remember thinking to myself, if I can pick up and hold like a fossil, and I can dig it from a part in the earth that that it's only in that layer of the earth, shouldn't that be more like, if that's God's creation, shouldn't that be above the words of God that were translated through man? Like, that's God's direct creation. So shouldn't, you know what I mean?
It's handiwork. Yeah.
So it's like, it's his handiwork. Like, so shouldn't that be? And this was my early years, but I was like, shouldn't the earth be better evidence? Like, shouldn't that be more? That's like first. What's the word?
First degree of
first degree evidence, where like the Bible is translated through men, so it's second degree. It's like a testimony, right?
Right.
So I was like, why wouldn't we take what we see in science and then use that to inform our perspective on the Bible? I mean, there are people who do that, and I always point to Christians who, like, if someone's struggling with their faith and they don't want to struggle with their faith, I will often point them to Michael Jones, or there's a lot of organizations on the internet that try and marry up the theory of evolution with the Bible and things like that. What are your thoughts around that whole concept, where science and the literal translation of Noah and the magical zoo boat?
Magical zoo boat. I like that. Well, I
hope that wasn't offensive. Sorry.
Oh, you're not going to offend me. Trust me. Appreciate the sensitivity. But no, I actually wrote about 10 years ago or so. I had an entry to get to have like a bit of a platform with Huffington Post back when it was still kind of a little more interesting before she left.
Okay.
And I wrote a piece actually after watching a debate between is it Ken Ham and Bill Nye the Science Guy? And
that was the thing that got me questioning everything.
Did it?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Well,
yeah.
I wrote a piece the next day, and I was like, evolution is never going to convince a creationist, because you're not having the conversation in a way that both members of the conversation can hear. And I feel like when you just say this is wrong or this is dumb, even just to someone who says I need a creationist view of the world because that's what works for me and that's what I believe, like you can't just come at that. You have to have a conversation about how to consider these things differently. And I think that it's, from where I am now, I think it's really fun that I can look at the first creation story and say, that generally follows the order of evolution. Like, that's pretty cool, right? Like, that's how, I look at it that way. Or I like it when, somebody's written some sort of story to try to explain some sort of natural phenomena, like the rainbow story and part of the floods stories. And, that's my engagement with science and the Bible, is they're not trying to do the same things. They weren't trying to actually explain in the way that we mean that, right? They were explaining in the best way they knew how at the time. And gosh, aren't these myths fun?
Yeah. I don't know how much you have. I mean, with all the reading you do, I don't know how you do anything, to be honest. But with I don't know how much you know about other religions of the world, like Hinduism or creation stories from other kind of concepts. But it's I mean, I've only read a small little bit of literature there, but it's really interesting to me that, for me, religion has become so much more impressive now that I view it the way that I do, which is I view religion as man's earliest attempts at trying to understand the cosmos.
Exactly.
So it's like the battle cry of humanity. It's like this is where we're at. This is how we perceive things. And when I look across cultures, you can kind of see how ideas kind of develop within the culture of the time, and it's fascinating to me. I really love religion. I've become a lover of religion.
That is fascinating, actually. Yeah. Are you familiar with? I used to use there's a website called The Big Myth. When I used to get to do just one testament, in an intro to just one of the testaments. But they've evolved over the years, but that website has quite a few creation stories from around the world. And it's really lovely because it points to, well, yes, there might be a creation story for people in Australia that includes kangaroos, or New Zealand's might include tsunamis, or some, Inuit people might include, polar bears and things like that, issues that they dealt with, and that might be included in their creation story. And very much to your point about the cultural context is important, the geopolitical context. And so I don't know, to be honest, I'm not well versed on a lot of the different creation stories or early myths, but I do have a general sense. I do teach intro to world religions. And that's very kind of surfacey. I don't get to dive too deep with that.
Yeah.
But,
yeah. Have you read the Bhagavad Gita before?
I have.
Yeah.
Just once, and then I read through parts of it with students when I get to do it in person. Yeah. What's your take on it?
Well, I was just going to say, and I'm about to read out Gnostic Informant's comment, but when we were talking about this the other day, where we were talking about the Bhagavad Gita, I remember reading it poolside, drunk in Bali. My wife was next to me, and there's techno blaring, and it's a pool party on this rooftop, and I've got these headphones, and I'm listening to the Bhagavad Gita, and chapter 9 hit, and I was like, whoa! Chapter 9's
is that where he reveals himself?
It's the part that's I am the flame.
Yes.
That's consumed.
Yes.
And I was just like, whoa, this feels like something out of Isaiah or something.
Exactly. It does. Yes. Yeah.
And I was blown away. And it gave me that same feeling I get when I read the Bible, which is the same. I get those feelings of warmth and stuff like that. Not all the Bible. Not all of the Quran or anything. There's some parts that we'll be going over in our slavery panel that I definitely have very different emotions for. But it's interesting how these, for me, I don't have any belief in a God, but I still have these strong, warm feelings towards that. But it's more from a human perspective. It's more from I love that humanity's this is humanity's I don't know how to describe it. I need to go learn some poetry and write it down. But
well, maybe. But I hear what you're saying, right? That you resonate with other humans' attempts to put voice, to put words to these experiences, right? And sometimes you do need some sort of psychedelic language to describe whatever. I don't have too many of those experiences, just to be honest. But
it would be interesting. We should do a whole other conversation about psychedelics. We both drink ayahuasca as the
Right?
no,
Wouldn't that be fun? Oh my gosh.
Watch us have a panic attack for 6 hours. So Gnostic Informant asked a question. Thank you so much for the super chat. Completely normal in the Greek world was the concept of teacher-student relationship that was known as beloved, which often times involves same-sex relationships. Do you think John's beloved disciples show any resemblance?
Somebody put him
Spicy
up to
question.
that because I did a whole thing with him on that. So
Oh, okay.
That was nice of him to, put the hook in there. I do.
So,
yeah. No, I think
wow.
I know. There's a
Okay, so this is where all the fundamentalists turn off the stream.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I didn't approach that very well, did I? So here's the thing. There's one of my colleagues who recently died a few years ago, but his name is Theodore Jennings, and New Testament scholar. And he wrote a book called The Man Jesus Loved, Homoerotic Narratives in the New Testament. And
wow.
Yeah. So
wow.
Yeah. And
that feels blasphemous even to say.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I have to say, I bring this into the book I've just wrapped up recently that is now in my publisher's hands. But the book I've recently written is on marriage in the Bible. What do the texts actually say about it? Or what do the texts say? But when I first read Ted's work, where he walks through essentially and shows us how John's gospel, I should say, he wears the lenses of the lover-beloved relationship, and he shows us how several of the passages line up and actually help me make more sense of them when I look at them through this lens. Doesn't mean that's the way you have to read it all, but it made so much more sense to me that way. And when I first read it, I was already PhD, I'm an ally, an LGBTQ ally. I'm working on my heteronormative, wiring in my head, working on my racist wiring, trying to take it all apart, I'm very conscious of all these elements. But even as I read that, I was like, Jesus couldn't have sex with a man. Like the initial things running through my head. And, which just says all these different things about the associations we have with Jesus. If Jesus was actually God, he couldn't have had sex, much less with a man.
With a man, it feels blasphemous for me to even link it, even though I don't believe. But I linked the book. I linked the book in the description. Yeah.
Okay.
I think I'm not normally like this. I think talking to you and knowing that you're a strong Christian and a PhD, I'm trying to be super respectful, and I think that's rubbing off on me, and I'm being more I'm normally a little spicier when it comes to questions about God and stuff. So if this is the first time watching, know that I'm not always feeling I mean, there was one stream where I was doing a speaking in tongues off with someone, so that was wild. That felt blasphemous as well. Anyway, so I mean, obviously that's not that concept that Jesus was in a homosexual relationship is not probably the consensus perspective.
No, it's not. But let me clarify also, and this is what it kind of gets interesting, right? One of the things going on from my perspective as a biblical scholar, not set aside whatever my personal beliefs are on this, as a biblical scholar, it's important to me to note that what they were doing was the gospel writers were not trying to tell history. They were trying to present a depiction of Jesus, or I sometimes talk about it as trying to craft or create an essence of Jesus that they're trying to convince others of. And this is why actually we should read them separately instead of trying to blend them together. Matthew says this and Mark says that, and connecting it no, stop doing that. But it's in particular when you look at John, because it is so different from the first three, and we do tend to talk about them separately, but in academic circles. But John's is the only one that makes it very, very clear that Jesus is God, blah, blah, blah. John is writing for a Greek audience. And there are a lot of pieces we can point to. My favorite one is the opening scene, where it's very much describing kind of that Neoplatonic creation story. The logos, that's the emanations of the logos, the overflow of the logos is what is used to create all of the world. That's the Greek idea, and that is now being applied to Jesus in the opening scene of John. So it's very clear that they're trying to appeal to a Greek audience, and this particular element of the lover-beloved relationship, whether it's teacher-student, as oh my God, I'm spacing his first name right now, as Gnostic informant suggests.
Neil. Yeah.
Neil, thank you. I was like, why can't
yeah.
Whether it's teacher-student or kind of older man, younger man in community, but that relationship was acknowledged and was part of the fabric, right? And so to show Jesus having a beloved, to show that he was in that kind of a relationship makes sense for the audience the author of John's Gospel is trying to reach. It doesn't mean that historically Jesus actually had a male lover. It just means that somebody wanted this character, Jesus, to appeal to a whole bunch of Greek men. And so that's one of the ways you're going to do it, is put this element in there. That comment that I've just made is also scary to people. And I get that, right? Like, what do you mean? He made some stuff up, yeah, that's kind of what I mean.
Yeah. I can feel so many people have turned off by now. So many Christians like, no, I'm out of here. They'll come back in a few years.
That human element is hard to,
100%. So you're a huge LGBT ally, but what I love about your book is you don't come out and say, like, God loves gays, get over it. You essentially, you use the Socratic Method all through the book. You're constantly asking the audience to think about, well, what are your thoughts on this before we go into it? And then now that we've gone into this topic, what are your thoughts now? And do you think this is fair, or do you think this makes sense? Or I remember, I used to go see a psychologist, and he, when I was a Christian, and he would say, would a loving God really do that? And I'm like, well, you don't really know, I remember saying, I'm like, it's hard. I'm like, it's hard because you don't really know, you're like, but one of the parts for me, when I was deconstructing, and he might even be watching it now, this stream right now, but if he is, Colin, comment. But the first guest I ever interviewed on Deep Drinks was one of my dearest friends who I met in ministry college, who was closeted for 45 years. So he, and he tried to pray the gay away. He tried to do all that kind of stuff.
Guy.
Yeah, and as I was kind of deconstructing, he was kind of trying to go through the Bible and trying to find answers to all this stuff, and dealing with it. Eventually, got to the point where, he was having conversations with pastors and stuff, and it got to the point where they're like, yeah, let's honestly look at this. We might be able to find homosexuality might be okay, and then it would get to a point where he's like, well, this looks like ambiguous, and then they're like, yeah, well, we have to trust the scribes knew what they were doing, and that was like the end all. So anyway, but I remember thinking to myself personally, like, what if the church throws away this doctrine like they did with women's having to wear headscarves when they pray? Or what if they throw away this doctrine like they did with, there's lots of stuff the church has changed their mind on, or like
slavery.
They don't. Yeah, slavery, right?
Just for what?
I was like, so what if that happens? I was like, and you've just wasted your entire life, and he had really bad anxiety and depression and stuff. And now I can say that he's in a happy long-term relationship of a couple years, and
happy for him.
Yeah. So can you go into a little bit about, like, I imagine that at the start, you probably didn't hold the perspective that gay was okay or whatever. How did that develop?
It's interesting. This is going to sound like a tangent, but I promise it's related. My parents made sure that my brothers and I got to be exposed to live theater growing up. And I am so grateful for that. What that means is I was around a lot of actors, and I even ended up working at the theater for a summer. And so I remember like interacting with these people who were, two men, they're couples, and this guy hits on me, and they're like, he's straight when he's sober and gay when he's drunk. You know, like these random conversations. You're like,
Yeah,
oh,
yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah,
what
yeah.
does that even, you know? So like I loved all these people, but I still had a theological idea that said that that wasn't right, but I didn't know how to, but nobody was asking me to reconcile that. So yes,
Mm,
when I went to seminary, I had lots of meals with a friend of mine whose brother was gay, and just trying to like work it out for myself, you know. And again, it's really about coming back to your point a little bit. It's really about human realities actually need to have a stronger voice in this conversation, Jen, than just what the Bible says. You know, like you
mm,
can't. It doesn't. Human realities and experiences far exceed what is contained in the Bible. And so they need
mm,
to be taken into consideration. And so that's I mean, very slowly, you know, like I have all these friends who are, you know, closeted or semi out or, you know, and so I had, you know, I had time to slowly work it out for myself. And as
mm,
compared to this issue with women in leadership, for me was much more pressing. Um,
mm,
but then in 2012, I was in a situation where, you know, there was a conversation at the state level about marriage, and whether or not, and there was a vote, a constitutional vote that was going to essentially define marriages between a man and a woman within the state constitution. And so that's what got me invested in actually trying
mm.
to talk about it and to write a little bit more publicly as a public scholar, which is a funny label, but you know, I just think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the Bible does and doesn't say on this particular topic. And
Mm.
I have found, as you noted about my book, Permission Granted, I have found it's a lot easier to have a conversation when you're asking questions and
Mm.
asking people what they're thinking and trying to kind of meet in the middle, you know, as compared to telling someone that they're cruel because they don't love, you know, like
Yeah,
that doesn't get very far.
and I think yeah, and I think that's the point is like, and you've got to be able to, you've got to go into the conversation being willing to change your mind as well. Like that's like, and that's really hard to do. And I think that's why a lot of people don't do it, is because you've got to, people can kind of see if you're trying to, I guess, be dishonest and like mislead them into like,
Absolutely.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
So if you come into it, like I like to approach conversations, like hard conversations with people, as if we're both detectives trying to work out the problem. Like, and I go, well, what about this
Mm.
issue here? And then, you know, and I think that's like a really, and that's what you do in your book. And just to shout out your book, people go listen to it on Audible. That's the first thing. It's got
Aw.
1 5-star review, which is me.
Oh, thank you.
Here. I cannot stress how much
Oh.
it bothered me that there's not more reviews on this one, because the production value is great. Everything
Oh,
is
thank you.
fantastic. It was such a good. You read it perfectly because obviously you're the author, but it's fantastic. And if you
Thank you
want
for that.
to purchase the actual hardcover book, which I will be doing, I'm going to be spending all my pocket money on the autograph version. So because I needed to write something sassy in there, like Dr. Josh wrote something sassy in his book that he signed for me. So and of course it's a good time to shut out your website. So you have a new podcast coming up.
Do we have our 4th episode was just released. I haven't listed them here. I just put the link to
Yeah,
our Wild
the
Olive.
well,
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah,
And of
very fun.
course your YouTube channel. Everyone go
Mhm.
subscribe to
Aw.
Dr. Jennifer Bird. She's got amazing content. You know, even as a non-Christian, it's really good to kind of look at this stuff and see like the theological approach that you can take. If you do run into a bigot in the street, you can point them to Dr. Jennifer Bird's channel, of
Thank you for
course.
that. Thank
And
you.
just quickly, a self plug for myself. We have
Yeah.
a Deep Drinks Patreon page, and the first 12 people that sign up for it will be getting canonized as the first 12 disciples of Deep Drinks.
I love that.
So we have Godless Engineer and Cheryl, and doesn't matter if you need to pause your membership or stop it or whatever, doesn't matter. You'll always be immortalized as canonized into the thing. And we have different sects. So check that out if you can support this channel. And of course, next week we have not next week, sorry. I'm doing more and more episodes. People should note this. I'm pushing really hard to get more and more episodes. But tomorrow we have Dr. Kip Davis on to
Nice.
talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm excited to learn about them because I don't know much about the Dead Sea Scrolls, so I'm excited to learn all about them.
Nice.
And then we have on Monday, the very next day, we have a pastor turned porn star, stripper. So that's an interesting conversation. You know her from Dr. Phil. You know her from Dr. Phil. Her story is actually interesting. She was a preacher. You can still watch her preachers on YouTube. And then she realized that she was queer. Like she started, but you know how some people can like kind of realize that really late in life. She realized she was queer, and then she didn't like how the Bible taught certain things. I'll tell her about your book when we have a stream together. But that's Monday. That's going to be a good one. And of course, the slavery panel, which is just wait till you guys see the advertisements I've got for this. I've been working with the skeptic John, and we've made some funny. He's done some voiceover work, and we're making some funny clips for this that are going to troll all the apologists to come out. And,
that's awesome.
so this is going to be a good panel, guys. Make sure you subscribe so you can check this out.
That is fun.
Enough of that. Let's jump into. Can you go over a little bit, because I'm sure a lot of people really care about it. What's your perspective on I guess women in church, and then I guess we'll touch back on homosexuality, like from a scholarly perspective. So why Eve was deceived first, Jennifer? That's why. Yeah. So why? So tell me, like from a scholarly perspective, why should women have human rights? And so. Sorry. But wait. So from a scholarly perspective, how do you cross that bridge between, like, the Bible says this on face value, and how do you go over this in your book, but maybe you can give us like an overall, just a general perspective here, and people go check out the book, link in the description. But yeah, how do women become pastors or have authority over men?
Yeah. So quick takeaway on that, I would say, is there are biblical passages. So passages in the newer, I call it newer, not the New Testament, but the Newer Testament has writings that, coming from Paul saying, I commend to you Phoebe, the head of your church. Well, our English translations, and potentially other translations, I don't read anything other than English when I'm reading the Bible, but I imagine it happens in other languages as well, is my point. The translation tones down her importance by calling her a servant, or instead of a minister. And so Paul didn't ever talk about roles in the church. He talked about people having gifts, right? In Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 12, both chapters, he's talking about spiritual gifts and the gifting that God gives you. And it's enlivened by the Holy Spirit, and God gives. So use your gifts, right? Use them for the body of Christ. No gendered language going on there when it comes from the genuine Paul. So Romans and 1 Corinthians, just, you've got a gift, use it. So that's really how to get to it. That's how, for people who need the scripture to affirm something, that's how you get there.
So when you say genuine Paul, can you just touch on that briefly?
Sure. I mean, there are 13 letters in the Newer Testament attributed to Paul. We're pretty everyone agrees that 7 of those 13 he definitely had a hand in. He and his letter writing buddies, I like to say, because he didn't actually write them. They had an amanuensis, and he and he was collaborating. He wasn't just coming up with this on his own. He was collaborating.
Wow.
I know that changed things for
me.
All
that Renaissance Christian art lied to me.
I love it.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, and then there's 6 letters that came along later, and they're attributed to Paul. But Paul was likely killed in the mid-60s, and these are written much later. And whether or not he did write them doesn't matter, and it does. It depends on the day and the topic, because they're in there. That's what matters, is they're in the canon. But there's some reasons we can say, he probably didn't have a hand in writing this, but they wanted to attach it to Paul's name for various reasons. That's a quick way to get exposure, right? Because people listen to Paul. Or maybe there was an idea in one of Paul's genuine letters that took off in a way no one anticipated, and it's causing problems. And so we're going to
Mhm.
come along in Paul's name and correct that to kind of shift the trajectory a little bit.
Mhm.
There are all kinds of reasons why very few are actually negative, but reasons why people would do that. Um, so as a as a professor, when I'm talking with my New Testament students this past week, I was like, okay, they're all in there, but let's talk about the fact that we have the early stuff that's genuine. Paul has more openness. It has more equality between men and women than we see in the later. And
Mm.
that, I think, is a point that we can talk about, whether or not he actually wrote them, because it shows us that as things started to settle in and people started to need things like defining roles, and we're people are watching us now. People are seeing this movement and it's being observed, and we need to make sure we're not being politically subversive or perceived as being politically subversive. So all these things come along, and that's why we have writings like Colossians and Ephesians and First Peter that include these household code roles that makes it much more patriarchal again, or makes the hierarchy between men and women much more clear.
Mm.
Did that all connect and make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, and I love what you say in the book. I'm not going to remember it perfectly, but you say something along the lines of like, you don't. I imagine you don't see the Bible as the perfect ordained word of God. With you see humanity as humans. You see humanity in it. Like humans wrote it on behalf of, I guess you imagine, God. But what I find interesting is you mentioned like, I wonder what the women would say. Like, I wonder what they would have said if they had the chance to write down their thoughts. What are their perspectives on all these things? When the men are saying this, are they saying like, I don't really think that's accurate, or I don't really think God's like what
Yeah.
would they say? Yeah.
Yeah, and that actually, to me, brings us back to the one you referenced, the passage you referenced, in First Timothy. I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. And you also referenced the explanation or potential explanation for why,
Yeah.
right? That Eve was deceived first, and then Adam. You know, when it says, I there's a lot going on in First Timothy, in my opinion, that makes it hard to talk about it quickly. But in general, I do think about that letter as addressing. So some guy is addressing, whoever it is, doesn't matter to me. They're addressing what they're perceiving or what they're hearing about that's happening. And they're telling a bunch of maybe chatty women, I don't know, who are really intellectually curious and are sharing the stories they're hearing. He wants that to stop for whatever reason, and he just puts a kibosh on it instead of saying, "Hey, can we talk about this?"
Yeah. Yeah.
Which gets back to your point. What would women have said? How would they have? How would they tell the story differently? And I think that applies throughout the entire Bible. How would Sarah
Mm.
have told the story about Abraham almost sacrificing Isaac? How?
Mm.
I mean, we can go down the list on that,
Yeah,
but
because something I've learned recently is women are people too.
oh yeah,
So like,
you've
yeah,
heard. Oh, cool.
yeah. So it's to me that's to me even I was a Christian, I couldn't I find it hard to perceive the Bible as as God ordained, I guess, because I would think that any holy text that has a very like if it was just all written by women and it was like this is the holy text, I'd be like that's still missing half the population, Um, so yeah, for me, it's like I wonder where the women's voices are a lot of the time. Like, why aren't they
Nice.
just as there as men's voices? But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I love actually, I'm glad that it's really lovely to hear that you think that way. One of the assignments I give my intro students to the Hebrew Bible is I ask them to write a letter from Sarah to Abraham after they read Genesis 12, where he pimps her out to the Pharaoh, right? And it's fun. It's fun to read what they come up with. But and
have you
what do
got
you
any horror stories about that? Have you got any
like
like
triggered?
interesting? Well,
No.
like, have you got any anyone that's come up with a kind of an excuse for it or something, or like?
Mm. Yeah, a lot of people that grow up in the church do a lot of explaining and justifying and just saying, I know you're doing the best you could, or I know you still love me, all that kind of stuff. But I also get some really sassy, like, this is the note they left on the kitchen table so he could read it in the morning and she's gone, kind of.
Yeah.
It's a whole range. But my point was, then, they've never had someone actually bring this to their attention. So they've never stopped to think about it, that you can bring this observation you've just made for us, David, into pretty much any passage, any story in the Bible, even if with a female maybe at the center, it's still being written by men. And so even Esther's story or Ruth's story, they're still being written by men as far as we know. So, it just isn't, even those stories might need some help,
Yeah, of course. Pirate Barb said, Jennifer, I recently saw a debate you had with a heavily indoctrinated young woman. I was impressed with how you were able to keep your cool. You're awesome.
Oh, thank you for saying that, first of all. And I love, I've forgotten the dude's name, but I love your icon, your profile picture.
Tim Minchin's.
Hilarious.
Yeah.
I love him.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Pirate Barb. I tried really hard to be respectful to her, with her. And it wasn't really, I'm not a debate person because I don't find debating and arguing useful. But there was a reason to do that. And so I did it. And that's nice of you to say, Barb. Can you tell that I'm still of mixed feelings about that whole thing?
Yeah. I'll have to check that one out. I'll have to find it when we finish, because I don't know the reference. But
and I'll just say, you don't need to. It's a 3-hour thing. But I will say that my favorite part was when I finally just had the space, and I just said to her, and it was near the end, and I said, I just wish we could have this conversation in 20 years. Once she's had some life experience, because she's, she's just trotting out the lines she's been told. She doesn't know any life behind these comments, and I'm like, well, when you've been pregnant and you're not trying to be pregnant, this conversation's different.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. There's I have, so on Deep Drinks, I try to keep cool, calm, and collected, but I'm the opposite. I love internet blood sports. I love, I've got a video on my other channel where it's just me laughing at this really racist, homophobic, like Jew hating. He literally screams like at Jews in the street, like this guy's a psycho, and he kept harassing me, and so I jumped on and I just trolled him for 30 minutes. He jumped off, and it was so satisfying. It was really enjoyable. So I have two different sides, but
nice.
So with homosexuality, so how do we get, and I'm sure many people watching will appreciate this, how do we get from homosexuals should be put to death to same-sex marriage is cool? How do you go from that biblically, scholarly?
Okay.
Or can you?
Do you need the 30-second version or the 5-minute version?
Look, this is Deep Drinks. Give us the longest version you possibly can.
Yeah, because the way you set that up was kind of interesting and helpful. How do you go from these people should be put to death to they're humans and whatever? Okay, so
they also are people. I found
they are. I do not identify, but so they are humans that I don't want to talk about as being different from me, but they are. These are humans. So it's it's helpful, I think, to look at the laws more broadly when it comes to those claims about the laws that say to put to death, right? You're to put to death a couple that's having an affair. You're supposed to put them to death. You're supposed to put to death anyone who kidnaps a person. That requires or somehow justifies the death penalty. Anyone who curses mother or father, should be put to death. So, and then what's so interesting to me, which I realized in writing the book, which I mean, genuinely, it's so fun when you're able to keep having new insights, like from reading scholarship or whatever. That list of, in Leviticus 18 and 20, those lists of, who a man cannot have sex with.
Yeah.
It's like all the women he would meet at a family reunion, right? You're not supposed to have sex with any of these women. But I just never stopped to think about the fact that those two sets of laws make it very clear that men are having sex outside of marriage, and these are the ones you just can't touch.
Whoa, interesting.
Right? And
I
they
don't know
say,
if I picked.
yeah,
Yeah, that's interesting.
yeah. So
I don't know if you picked that, if that was in your book.
nope,
Or
no,
and I'm
it's in the one
okay,
I just
cool,
wrote.
okay.
Yeah, no,
Oh,
it's in
I can't
because I
wait
was
to
like,
read that.
wait a minute, I hadn't thought about it this way, and they had to put it in there twice, which is also interesting. And so, from a historical perspective, I'm trying to calm down just a little bit.
No,
From a
don't calm
historical,
down.
well, yeah, from
No.
a historical perspective, like, stop and think about the things that people needed to be told
Hmm.
and the level at which they are legislating when it comes to laws. The, you know, the level of the extreme punishments, right? That
Hmm.
is, there's an extremity involved here that is not very healthy or helpful,
Hmm.
right? These are not good parenting techniques
Hmm.
to just smite people for whatever, right? Okay, so I think it's helpful to start there, that these are ancient laws that tell us where they were coming from and how they viewed the world. So there's a starting point. The next thing I would suggest is the laws that do talk. There are only two verses in the Hebrew Bible and one or two in the Newer Testament that address this whole conversation about what we call homosexuality. And there's no evidence that they saw it this way at all, an understanding of human sexuality as any kind of orientation. Okay. So they're not thinking about it the same way. But those two laws, a man shall not lie with a man as you do a woman. What was going on for them? Is that just the whole issue of don't waste your semen? Because, it's not going to, you can't impregnate another man. I think that's possible. I don't think it's the main reason, to be honest, but I do think that's part of it. Like, we got to populate and procreate.
Mm-hmm.
I think it really is more about just what we think of as homophobia. I think it is more about this honor shame system, and that no man would ever allow himself to be penetrated like a woman. No man would ever choose to be the passive one in sex. And the reason I say that is I think it is deeply important to me for people to understand the way sex is talked about in the Bible. It is a thing a man does to a woman, not something a couple enjoys together. It's a very common ancient trope to talk about sex. Even philosophers, 2nd century BCE to 3rd or 4th century Common Era, talked about sex as something that a man does to a woman, or someone lesser in class. So it could be a young man, but there's an active person and a passive person. This is the conception. And no male, real true male with honor, would allow himself to be put in that position. And so, that is, I do think, primarily what's going on in those two verses. So, so then you're like, well, if that's what it says, then that's what God means. I'm like, yeah, except for the fact that this is how we're born, right? We're born with things going on. And I feel like there's a tangent here too, because I'm absolutely endorse and support people. I know plenty of women who identify more as hetero, but have chosen to be in relationships with women. And, I'm totally fine with that. So it's complicated, but like, just in general, when you come out of your mother's uterus with the wiring you've got, if you talk about God as creating us, then God created that. And so I just need to create some space to say who you are is how is good. God, if you believe that God creates us, then this is a good thing, who you are. And then you get onto,
I had a pastor tell me, I'll call him out, Alan Beadle, and he he told me when the same-sex marriage plebiscite was happening. First of all, we had a same-sex marriage plebiscite in Australia, where Australia was voting on whether or not the gays should be able to have the rights, human rights, and be able to get married.
Should be able to have the human rights, exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
And by the way, my friend Colin, he's like, you need to stop saying the gays because people think you're serious. Like, people think but I'm saying it ironically. But anyway, so and he said he was quoting this document called the Gay Manifesto, as if it was real. It was a satirical piece from, I think, the 80s that was like, oh, we want to take over, and he was quoting it as if it was real. And even after we pointed it out, he still continued to he didn't care. He just wanted the message.
Yeah.
And secondly, he said to me, well, the reason, I said, why did Jesus talk about, I think, did Jesus talk about slavery? Maybe he didn't, or servants.
Depends on how you want to ask that. Yes, he uses slaves in some of his parables.
Yeah, okay, and we'll talk about that on the panel, on the slavery panel. But I was like, why didn't Jesus mention homosexuality? Like, it's only mentioned in the New Testament with Paul. And his answer was, because homosexuality wasn't a problem at that time in that area of the world. So like, there was homosexuality in ancient, in the desert, as the Israelites were walking through the desert for 40 years. I can't imagine that would have been a nice experience, sandy and dry, right? For men to have sex with each other. And then when we get to Rome, the churches in Rome and stuff, no homosexuality. No. That's why he didn't need to bring it up, because it wasn't a problem.
It wasn't a problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
When I, because I do think through the Bible, like, what is the Bible saying, and how do we use it to say positive things? And there, at the end of the day, there are some passages that are just hurtful and that are, I think, are just outright wrong. And so, I've come to a place where I'm okay with that, and I know how to make sense of that for myself. It is not a place I was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, or whatever. When I started seminary, I wasn't there because I needed scripture to affirm something in order for it to be okay for me. I needed that. And, what's interesting to me is when you come at that conversation, those who need the Bible to affirm something in order for it to be okay today, well, I've got news for those folks. The Bible doesn't anywhere affirm a loving marriage entered into by two equals.
Well, yeah.
So if we need it to affirm it, it doesn't.
Well, I'm sorry, Jennifer. I went to a wedding yesterday, and you must be wrong, because that's all that was talked about. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken, and we bring, So that's interesting. I never actually thought about that concept. That isn't marriage. The idea of love in marriage is kind of a modern.
It is a modern thing, yes.
Yeah.
And the passages that people like to have read at weddings, 1 Corinthians 13, like, that's beautiful. Some of it I still don't like, but it's still, he was talking to the community. He wasn't talking to a couple at the altar getting married. He was talking to how we treat each other, right?
Interesting.
Ephesians 5. I had this awkward moment where I was teaching a New Testament class, and one of my students got married that term and asked me to come to his wedding, and I did. And it was 2 weeks after I had just torn Ephesians 5 apart in class. And of course,
what's Ephesians 5?
Ephesians 5, 21 to 33. The women submit yourselves.
Oh, submit to your husband. Yeah.
As you do to the Lord, and men, love your wives. And then that whole thing about this is a mystery, and I'm referring to Christ in the church.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
My wife, actually, they read that out yesterday. My wife said, I didn't like that bit. I was like, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. No disrespect to them, by the way, like, if they're watching, and obviously we love you, but yeah, it was just a different perspective.
And part of it is they've probably never stopped to think it through, or even think that one through critically. You know what I mean? It just sounds lovely when you read it with the right tone of voice.
Yeah. It's like and we'll talk about this on the panel, but you know, the apologetics I'm going through for slavery is amazing. The way they reword something, like Paul Copan in his book Is God a Moral Monster? He talks about, this is amazing. This is so amazing. Talking about tone, he talks about owning another human being as property so that you can pass them on to your children as inheritance, right? So your children get them.
Right. Yeah.
He talks about that as like, oh, well, you know, if the slave really enjoyed the social and benefits and became part of the family, he could even stay there and be part, you know, like he talks about like the slave is like, oh yeah, I'd love to be a slave
Benefiting
forever.
from
Like
this.
it's crazy. It's crazy. We got a super chat from Nitty. Thank you so much, Nitty. Finally, yes, we are monetized. It makes a huge difference. I'm pushing
that's sweet.
really hard.
Nitty's
Guys,
a friend, apparently.
Yeah, Nitty's a great guy, and he's been on the channel before. Everyone go subscribe to Nitty. He's got good content. There's the other thing too. I want to mention to everyone that this is I'm making this my full-time job. I want to continue to do Deep Drinks podcasts and be able to produce content around scholarship, human rights, religion, philosophy, maybe science even. And so if you want to help us get there, obviously super chatting's awesome. Sharing these streams are awesome, liking. And straight after this on the Patreon, I'm going to be doing a live stream, an unlisted live stream, talking about how I prepare for an interview, how I get all the notes, how I find my guests, and what I do to kind of put together a show for anyone who's interested in that, which I don't think too many people will be, but I needed to start somewhere with the behind the scenes stuff, right? Yeah. So yeah, if you want to support and become one of the first 12, go check that out. And thank you, Nitty. I did want to ask you, Jennifer, where do you get your morality from, if not from the Bible? That's a question that I know so many, and it's a bit of a troll question, but I know it's a question that a lot of people will ask you. Like if they ground their morality in what in the Bible, which I like what Dr. Josh says. He says, if you do that, you don't know slavery is wrong, right? But if you don't get where do you start from with your morality? Like what, because you talk. Okay, let me back up. You talk about your litmus test in your book. Maybe you could touch on that, and then we could go into where do you get your morality from? Like, how do you determine what's right and wrong in the first place?
I was thinking I might read that part. Is that awkward?
Yeah.
If I do that?
No, absolutely not. I was going to do it, but I don't have the copy.
Yeah.
It takes 3 weeks for anything to get to Australia, which is a bummer. But
yeah, no, I know. Let's see. I start with this. Some of you might be wondering now what questioning a literal reading of the Bible or the typical way of reading certain passages can set in motion even more questioning. I recall having quite a knee-jerk reaction to it all, thinking, if this one thing about the Bible is not true in the way I thought the whole Bible was true and trustworthy, then where does it stop? What is to keep someone from challenging all of it? That slippery slope. So that's, that's where I start this kind of wrapping it up. And throughout this book, I'm asking people to just be very honest about what's there and to not try to explain it away, but just sit with it. And that's when people start to get uncomfortable, because you realize you've been given ways to explain it all away, but I'm asking you not to. And so, yeah, I guess this is where I talk about my litmus test. I'm trying to remember if it's right here. As I've talked through passages, I've held up my own lens for you to see how I view Scripture. Your lens or litmus test will be your own, and perhaps it will be quite different from mine. The important part for those of you who turn to the Bible for daily guidance or for theological claims is to be aware that your engagement in the world is directly affected by how you read the Bible. It's not the part I thought it was. But anyway, I think it is important for you to be conscious of what your litmus test is and to be assured that it is okay if it's different from what you were taught it should be. Where's the part where I talk about this? Anyway, here it is. Sorry, is this weird? Is this okay?
No,
I keep doing this? Okay.
This is not weird at all. This is not weird at all. And I do the same thing, especially because you wrote this in 2015, or it was published in 2015. Yeah, that's a long time ago.
It is, and I've I read it last year. It's been a while. So personally, I hold my understanding of who God is and is not as my lens in every encounter with Scripture, which is a whole different conversation, to be honest, because if I'm going to posit that there is God, then I want to say that it looks nothing like God who's described in the Bible. So that's I don't get into all that here in the book because it's too much. But I did a conversation with Derek on Myth Vision called Redefining God, and that's actually one of the books I still want to write. So whatever that 3-letter word means to you, David, or to your listeners, I imagine it might not actually mean the same thing as what I mean by God. Just putting that out there, okay? But I have a litmus test for Scripture and theological claims. If a biblical passage or theological doctrine endorses freedom, liberation, love, the fullness of life for all people, or a mature and responsible faith, then it is of God. When I see a passage that depicts God as wrathful or as dealing death blows to his supposed enemies or even to his own people, for instance, then that passage does not pass the test. When there are passages that contain belittling words or that endorse arbitrary restrictions of people, I assume those passages were inspired by human desires, not a loving and reconciling God. Most of all, I believe in the ability of human beings to make ethical, loving, and moral choices. This is what binds us together. I believe that when a biblical passage does not endorse such choices, then we need to be able to call it out instead of finding a way to uphold it anyway. So you asked me where my morality comes from. I think it comes from my family. I think it comes from my experiences as a female. And, it comes from observing like the doctrines of the church and realizing how harmful many of them have been for me. And so I think I actually more would, if I gave myself a label, I would call myself a humanist. And
okay.
I believe in the ability of humans to be fill in the blank. There's a handful of things there. So my morality comes from the fact that I've listened to people and I've observed, and I've tried to do a lot of reading. I've tried to be in touch with what's going on in the world. I've tried to hear from perspectives very different from mine. And I think of morality as what is it that's good for people. And I know that's a weird thing to say. I'm just kind of on the spot, kind of trying to define it for you. But
no, that makes sense. And that's great. Like I hold the same values. I try and I have a very interesting take on morality, I guess. I kind of disagree with a lot of the philosophical philosophers on this, actually. There's a big big meta-analysis of there was this big thing on, like, they asked a bunch of moral philosophers where do they think, a bunch of questions, and one of them was is morality objective or subjective, essentially. And the majority of them are morality is objective, and I was like, no way.
No, it's not. No, it's not.
These aren't Christians either. These aren't.
No, I know. They're just delusional slightly. They don't realize it.
Okay. Yeah. Well. Yeah.
Right.
Get into
what part of human experience is objective? None of it.
Yeah. Well, no, it's wild, and I was but it makes me pause because I'm like, okay, well, if the majority of scholars are saying I don't think they use the word objective. It's like something else. It's been a while since I looked into it, but I go even further than and it's interesting because I want to learn more about this, because I want to see where I'm wrong, because obviously these people think about this a lot more than I do. So I want to kind of learn about this, but with this subjectivity, I even go further than subjectivity. I don't even think morality really exists. I think people just operate within their own preferences. I think societies get built on these preferences. I think that tradition and culture plays a part of it, how you're raised. And I don't really think morality exists. And I think that
that's interesting.
So I'm kind of a moral anti-realist in a way, that I think that I just think people just operate within their preferences. And it's like, so how does someone go to prison? Yeah. How does someone go to prison though in that situation where what they did wasn't truly wrong? It's like, well, it's like morality exists in that it's something I don't like, right? Like someone can come in and physically abuse me now, and I wouldn't like that, so I could call that wrong. But it's not. It's that type. But ultimately, that thing I'm calling wrong is just there's nowhere in the universe I can point to and say there is morality.
Yeah,
So that's
right,
where I come
right.
from.
I think I hear what you're
So
saying.
yeah, I hope I'm making sense, and if not, I'll do a video on it. But so what are your perspectives on morality? So you have this litmus test, right?
Yeah.
A lot of Christians would say to you, where do you get your morality from if not from the Bible?
Right, right. And I
How
can't
do
help
you
yeah,
justify?
well, and I would say that since I grew up in the church, for sure, I think on some level that constructed some things for me, maybe in my thinking. But I disagree with so much of what the Bible asserts, and I'm okay saying that. And I'm okay thinking with my framework, and I'm okay like, I think I'm actually a much more moral person, a much more loving and kind and compassionate person now that I don't need the Bible to tell me what to think, the way I did in my 20s. So I think it's an interesting question because there's this part of me that, like, when you ask me that question, where does morality come from? I go off into that world of, well, we kind of all have some sort of thing in us that says
Yeah.
yes and no. And then there are also people who are sociopaths or psychopaths, and they don't have the same no or yes that we do, or that most of us do. So then that's a thing you got to deal with. You got to be honest, right? So that's why I referred to, I have tried to listen to, I've tried to listen to story. I've intentionally sought out when I didn't understand immigration issues, or when I didn't understand racial, like when I first started trying to understand the racist elements I had been given because of where I grew up. I intentionally sought out stories and people that would help me understand. So I, that from my perspective, that is where I get my morality, is that I am aware that I don't have the full picture here, and I'm actively finding others to help me fill it in from their perspective. I am I try to be sensitive to who other people are, where they are coming from. And I think that's why there's this general golden rule that has shown up around the globe in the ancient world, right? Treat others as you would like to be treated. Like that's pretty basic thing that lots of people have said at various points in time, and we kind of keep coming back to that, I think,
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard critiques of that, and like some people like to be, how like there's like sexual fetishes where
Oh,
like
sure,
people
yeah.
like to be like stepped on and like whipped and stuff. So it's like well, if you treat people like you want to be treated, like what I mean?
Right.
No,
We're not all into BDSM.
yeah,
Let's clear
yeah,
that. Right.
exactly.
Mhm.
Kip Davis, that's Dr.
Kip.
Kip Davis, who's he's tomorrow. Make sure you come out tomorrow because we're gonna be drinking Canadian whiskey, and he's getting ready to, I think, test me, and I've got a family dinner afterwards, so I'll probably be drunk. But should I sacrifice my firstborn to ensure the Calgary Flames make it to the playoffs? It seems like a long shot, and I have no daughters to sell. It's a good question. Good
Yeah,
question.
it is. It's very relevant. Very.
If morality is not objective, it's not definable. Yeah, I could see that.
Yes and no. Can you go back
Okay.
to that? Do you mind going
Yeah,
back to
let's go back
having
to that. Yeah.
Because here's the thing. Aside from like math and not even all math, but like some parts of science, those science is still highly subjective at times,
It is.
right?
The only thing, it's like maths is the only thing that you can
That's even
posit
close.
proofs.
Yeah, right. That was
of.
my
Yeah.
favorite class. I was a math major in
Yeah.
undergrad. It was my favorite class.
Yeah.
Proofs and all the like the history of math. But so, when you want to if we I find it interesting, and I love that Ray posed the question. Thank you, Ray, because or pose the challenge, if it's a retort, or if it's, I don't know if Ray actually thinks that we're crazy for saying that it's subjective, or they're just offering this as
Ray's a major troll in the chat. No, I'm kidding.
Oh, gotcha.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. He's not. He's not.
Okay.
He's not.
I'm like, what? So
he's not nice guy.
Okay. Yeah. If it's not objective, it's not definable. I mean, that I think that's an interesting place to start, but I don't agree with that, because everything like we can define our human experiences from our perspectives. and that will be utterly subjective.
Hmm.
Now, I think on some level, this challenge gets back to your point, David, that you're not sure that you do not believe that there's a thing out there that holds the tag of morality, right? Like it's not a thing you can point to, but that humans actually do. We act out of what works for us. And that's why this issue of rearing children well, in the formative ages is really important, because that's what's going to happen. Whatever they're given is how they're going to behave. And so, but it's still definable on a certain level, isn't it?
I think, I think that it's ultimately not definable, but I think that it's definable within a certain, within a context, within a framework, right? Like that's how I kind of view it. So I kind of agree with what you're saying. Like, so there was a story. I don't know how accurate I'm getting this, but essentially this guy tragically killed his family and then killed himself. And he wrote this in his suicide note. Please, I've been acting very strange the last few months. Please do an autopsy on my brain, right? And
interesting.
They did an autopsy on his brain, and they discovered that he had a tumor pressing on the part of his brain that was in control of emotional something
regulation.
I mean, it's because I'm not a neuroscience, I just imagine the brain's like, you press on this bit and this thing happens. So, but something was affecting his brain. And so I had this interesting conversation with Shannon Q about this, because she knows a lot about neuroscience, and I was like, where's the free will in that? And I'm also someone who thinks of the universe as more deterministic. So I imagine, like, if you were to, and maybe you could talk about this because you're a maths major, but like if you were to like push a rock down a hill, and if you knew every variable, the wind, what it would bounce on, the friction of the rock, every variable, you could predict with 100% certainty where that rock was going to land. Well, and you could run that experiment 1 billion times over and it would land in the exact same spot. I mean, there are quantum fluctuations, but we're not going to worry about that, like just in this hypothetical. So it would land in the same spot. Well, I just think the brain is a much more complicated version of a rock and a hill. And I think that human society is a much more complicated version of that. And the universe is much more complicated than that. So
agreed.
I'm more of a determinist in that I think free will is a bit of an illusion. But the interesting question is, from all of that preamble, is how do you then send someone to prison for something that they did that essentially wasn't their choice? It was their choice, but they were always going to do that based on the chemical structure of their brain and the environment they grew up in. And I'll give you my answer, and then you can comment. I think as a society, we have to act as if free will exists in order to have a functioning society. Like it's almost like we have to bite the bullet and go, we have to pretend free will exists. Otherwise society would just be chaos. Like people would just be, you could just do whatever you wanted, right? So it's almost like this farce, this lie that we have to tell ourselves. I mean, no one thinks about this as deeply as a lot of me and other nerds online, but like we have to, from my perspective, we have to pretend as if we do have free will in order to keep a functioning society. What are your thoughts on that? On all of that? So.
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on all of that, actually. And so I'll try to choose the ones that I think are most important, because I love that. I love the premise. I love the comments you've thrown out there, right? We have to pretend that we have free will in order but doesn't that whole thing about, I don't know. I'm not going to be able to put my thoughts to words is the problem here.
It's a hard one. It takes. I spent about 6 months thinking about it before I could articulate it.
So here's the thing. Like I really hate the whole conversation about free will because the men who came up with it were not taking into consideration all of the social factors and economic factors and all these other things. So that actually do impact the way we do behave, which is part of what you were getting at, right? Like people who are denied access to all kinds of things, education, safety, right? Feeling safe in their neighborhood, and ability to have a solid job that makes productivity joyful or lovely or whatever. Like there're just so many factors that play into why people end up doing things that end up being really awful and bad, right?
Yeah.
And so the same goes for the theological claims and philosophical claims about free will, because show me a female who's actually walking down the street at night doing exactly what she would like to do instead of thinking about all the ways she's trying to protect herself. Like, that's not free. And so the concept of free will in and of itself drives me fucking crazy. I just hate it. And I agree with your concept, with the point that you're making.
Maybe this was a conversation for our ayahuasca episode where we're both
I think so, because I get really cranky about
exist?
Yeah. Because
No, keep going. I was just making I was trying to make
I just
interesting idea.
Yeah, I get really I mean, part of it is also there's the Augustinian concept of free will, who's, early on and affected all the Catholics in the room, and then there's the later Reformation thing about free will, which is more about whether or not you actually get to go to heaven of your own choice. And, is the free will in terms of all the things I might do in my life, free will? Is that what we're talking? Are we talking about, like, where your destination?
It's
and
like
all those things?
it's like a whole other conversation. Like we could do a whole other episode on just that and not touch the surface. I do want to.
I just think that it's really important, at least to me as a woman, as a scholar, that it's even at your question that you posed about how is it right to send someone to prison if there is no such thing as free will, and I ultimately resonate with that, what I understand you to be posing there, because I think that those the realities that people are born into and the hundreds of years of issues that have led up to them and us, right? I think those are not taken seriously enough in these larger conversations or philosophical conversations about something like morality, because it's complex and most people have never stopped to think about it that way.
Yeah, it's very complex. You could devote your whole life to thinking about that.
You could.
Cheryl Lyle asked a super chat.
Cheryl?
Thank you. Cheryl's amazing. She's the first saint. She's the first disciple on Patreon. She was the first person to support us, and she'll always be immortalized there, canonized as a saint of deep drinks. It's so weird. It's so weird, but I love it. And also thank you so much, Cheryl, for super chatting as well. That's amazing. Every bit of money that we get helps me buy helps me work better towards creating more interviews and getting more people on and be able to focusing more on my time on this. And I'm grinding really hard. But Cheryl Lyle said, Dr. Bird, how would you respond to a Christian apologist such as Michael Brown, Sean McDowell, and John White, who have a different response to homosexuality than you do?
I would want to have a conversation, not a debate. I think Cheryl knows that, but to be honest, I don't read them or listen to them or read their, I don't go there. It's hard enough to do the work I'm trying to do without constantly being reminded of the what I consider to be under-informed thinking. And so I would have to imagine a few comments first. I would need a few comments to respond well to this question. What kinds of things are they saying? Because my sense is most the apologists are taking what they've been told the Bible says about homosexuality and saying that is actually true, and then going from there. So, and I think Cheryl can appreciate this. My first few thoughts are, I'd want to educate, and that's kind of rude and pompous for me to even say that.
No, well, I think you've got every right to educate, but you're the top of your field you're the top. You can't get any more educated than you currently are in New Testament and early Christianity, right? There's not PhD 2.0.
Right.
Yeah.
I think, and I guess it really just, that's why I'm feel like I'm not going to do this justice. You know, are they saying, for instance, are they saying things like what says in, you know, First Timothy and whatever in First Corinthians 6 that says, well, actually, no. So they're not actually, you know, we could get into conversation about that the Greek there is arsenokoites, and that word itself, we don't know what they mean by that word, arsenokoites, that you pull the word apart, that's man, arson, and koites sounds similar to coitus, right? Because it should, right? Lying with a man, having sex with a man, or is it a man having sex with a man? Like, we don't know what arsenokoites actually refers to in terms of practices and behaviors. But really, any of the passages in the Bible are talking about sex acts. They're not talking about human beings. And that's to be expected, because that's the level they were functioning at, was these acts. And so denigrating certain acts, and instead of having any sort of a foundation for being able to say humans come in a range of preferences, orientations, desires, all of those kinds of things. So the writers of the scriptures didn't understand humanity, didn't understand sexuality the way we can know and understand it today. So that's, you know, those are the things that are important to me to bring up about what is in the Bible, right? The Bible talks about sex and sex acts. It doesn't talk about human beings. And they have a very limited perspective on what kind of sex is appropriate or okay. And this, even just the concept of monitoring what people do, right? Like, really, you know, and people want to ask questions like the references to fornication. Well, what did they mean by that word? Did they mean any sex that couldn't lead to procreation? So 90% of the sex that heteros are having? Like,
yeah, there are a lot of I'm not sure if you've heard about this, but there are two things I want to discuss. There are a lot of people who engage in anal sex, like a lot of heterosexual couples who engage in anal sex as a way to save their virginity. So before, like, and then then there are a lot of then there's this thing called soaking, which has become popular in Mormonism. Have you heard about soaking?
Yeah, I think. Is this
so they won't consider it sex if no one's moving. So what they'll do,
yes,
this
they have friends moving them.
Yeah, they literally lie on a bed and like kind of like fall into one another.
Yeah.
Right. The man into the female. And then they'll have someone jump on the bed so they're not moving the bed.
Right.
The bed.
Right. Someone's moving them instead. Yeah.
And it's like, well, okay. All right. That doesn't sound fun, but like, okay. Like
the lengths people go to
yeah. Yeah. I've often thought, and I'd like to get your perspective on this, just as we're wrapping up, is I've often thought that maybe when Paul or pseudo Paul or whoever it was that was writing, you know, that these people will not inherit the kingdom of God. They're lustful, or whatever, the drunkards, all that stuff, and the homosexuals. I wonder if the homosexuality, and this is uneducated opinion, uneducated thought, but I wonder if that homosexuality wasn't reference to like a loving homosexual relationship, but maybe because it's in the context of sexual immorality, maybe it's talking about, maybe the concept is like a heterosexual man so overfilled with lust that he has sex with a man. You know what I mean? Like he's like, it's like the inability to control himself. It's like it's like rape, or it's like something to do with we're stuck on an island together for 6 weeks. Let's give each other hand jobs, like that kind of. I wonder if it's like that. If it's like if it's that kind of thing, rather than being overfilled with lust and then therefore engaging in homosexual acts, rather than like, I guess, people who love each other and expressing that through their love. And also, where are the women in all this? Why can't women?
Why do they not care how women have sex?
Yeah, a random aside, and this is, sorry to ramble so much, but I just have to get this out. But I'm doing a panel on purity culture soon. One of the things that bothered me so much about when I spoke to a lot of women about purity culture on the show, like Heathen Queen and things like that, and Emily from Feral Pastor's Wife.
Mhm.
They would talk about like they were taught in church that essentially they needed to cover up because essentially men wouldn't be able to control themselves. And men, we were taught you won't be able to control yourself, so you need to like don't masturbate, don't look at porn, don't try really hard to kind of fight back those urges. And then we'd have these like clubs where we would all like try to go see how long we could go without masturbating, and we would call each other and say pray, and the other person would go and pray because that person was horny. And then Sunday would come around, and then Martha, the receptionist at church, was wearing a blouse that showed 1 centimeter of cleavage. We're like, I can't take it, and then it fulfills the But the thing that bothered me about all of this is why weren't women taught that they could be lustful? Like why it's like they weren't even acknowledged that women could be like lustful, like pornography, masturbation, that they want to like objectify men. It was almost like the feminists came out of me and was like, hey, women can be dirtbags as well. Like it doesn't have to be. It was kind of annoying that it was taught in such a way, that it was taught like the 1950s version of marriage, where the lady grits her teeth and the man just like has his way and then moves on with his day. Like it's just, anyway. Do you have any comments on all
so
that?
many?
Okay.
One, that whole thing, the scenario you just set up, right? It's all about the man doing to a woman. This is ancient thinking about sex. There you go, right? This isn't about what humans might actually want to enjoy together, discover and figure out together. There isn't a healthy conversation about sex and sexuality at all. And your point is really important. I know people who don't think that women can masturbate.
Physically, like it's not physically
like
possible.
They don't think that they don't even realize it's a thing a woman could do.
Oh, wow.
Right?
What a sad
exactly. Especially when it's a woman who doesn't know that you could do this, right?
Yeah.
So, there are all kinds of thoughts that went through my mind. Mostly I just wanted to say, I'm so glad that you could see those things and see this is a problem, and perpetuating the problem by the way they're trying to fix the problem, right? That's part of what's happening. I like to talk about the issue of the label virgin and virginity. It's not really a thing. I like to talk about that. And I have a thing in my next book about that it's really just a construct to further, keep women in their place or keep them as property and blah, blah, blah. Gosh, there's so many things to say. I appreciate that people's discomfort with human bodies and with people have inherited, most people, the people that created the purity culture and that perpetuate it, it's been a part of what they were immersed in. And so I want to be compassionate about why people think such horrifically underinformed things about sexuality and human bodies. And I think that the church gives most people very negative perspectives on bodies and whatever thing it is that a body, yours, wants and desires. And so there's a lot of negativity on just normal, natural human urges or desires. And so even going back to your comment about like an oversex or a very highly sex, whatever you want to say, like horny, man wanting to have sex with another man. Like, I think it's really fascinating that we want to judge at all.
Yeah.
And so
that's a good point.
I think that we could, I responded to that woman, the young woman influencer, Christian influencer, who like went off about masturbation as like satanic and all this stuff. And I'm like, she strikes me as someone who could use an orgasm, and she probably never had one. You know what I mean?
And it's really sad. Hey,
I think so. Here's the thing, there were a lot of things very freeing for me when I stopped needing to attend to what Scripture told me. I changed my outfit, my attire for my boyfriend, so I wouldn't cause him to stumble. Like that's just, I understand that thinking, and I also am glad I'm not there anymore.
Yeah. I eat a lot of junk food so that I don't cause my wife to stumble. I don't want her, I don't want to. Yeah, it's funny. We used to have a roommate who was like ripped like a Greek god. He'd go to the gym twice a day and stuff.
Yeah,
And he'd
yeah.
walk around the house in like these in his like shirt off and with his lycra on or whatever. And I'm like, come on, man. I'm like, you're making me look like an asshole. Like you walk around like a Greek god. I'm sitting here with like a bowl of ice cream trying to watch a South Park or a movie or something.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway.
Causing your wife to stumble.
Yeah. I was like, stop. He causing me to stumble. I'm homosexual. And he causing me to...
Exactly.
Yeah. I have a few questions that I'd like to throw at you. And the first one is a question that I always end with a couple of deep questions. But this is one I just thought up.
Okay.
How do you resonate with Marcion?
Do I resonate with Marcion? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, or how do you resonate with him? Do you like him? Do you like his idea that he kind of rejected the cruelty of the Old Testament God and believed in yeah. But what are your thoughts on Marcion?
I like his chutzpah.
What's that?
Chutzpah. His willingness to do his own thing. And his ability to say no to that. I like that. And I like, I respect that. Marcion was a whole bunch of things. He wasn't just this guy who said no to the Old Testament God. But I like, it's very complicated for me, to be honest.
Because
I
don't know much about him.
Okay. Well, and here's the thing. When you throw out, just metaphorically speaking, the Hebrew Bible or whatever, you're also saying something about the people that do use that collection as their scriptures. So even if he's not trying to be anti-Judaic, that is also anti-Judaic. So I'm not a big fan of that. And do I personally uphold the Hebrew Bible God? No, and nor do most Jews that I know. Right, and even if they're devout, they don't actually uphold all of they don't endorse all of the descriptions attributed to God, because many of them are pretty harsh. There are also some pretty harsh descriptions of God, depictions of God in the Newer Testament. It's just that most people don't see it that way, or they read right past it. And I think, I have a video, the depiction of God in both Testaments. Like, God is loving and cruel in both. And that's important to me, that people grasp that. So Marcion also didn't have a problem with a lot of Paul's letters, and I do.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's my short response to your question.
Yeah, no, that's a good response. That's great. And of course, I have to ask you just briefly.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on slavery? We have a panel coming up. And what are your thoughts on slavery? Guys, just so you're aware, this is the dream team, like, panelists. Like, I'm going to be creating these videos, like I said, that are going to be kind of trolls to the trollers. To the trollers. So we have Dr. We just have look at this panel. Like, it's just wild. Like, that we have so many. I won't read out everyone's credentials or anything, but it's just crazy that we've got all these guys together, all you guys to come on and talk about this, because it'll be, to me, it's going to be the one-stop shop. It's going to be like, we're very formalized, aren't we? We've got I've got 9 pages of notes from apologists. And everyone's putting in, like, we're going to be creating a bibliography so people can go and do further reading into, like, scholarly resources. You'll be talking about the New Testament and early Christianity. And slavery. So what are your thoughts? Can you give everyone a teaser on slavery in the New Testament?
What was fascinating to me was to, like, realize some of the ways that just general things that Paul says very casually often refers to followers as slaves of Christ, slaves of God, which our translations cover over. So I wasn't aware of that. There were some things for me just learning about reading some of my colleagues, some of their scholarship on slavery and the rhetoric of slavery and how common that is in the New Testament writings. observing that Jesus refers to enslaved peoples in some of his parables, and he doesn't problematize it. He just assumes that we have slaves going on in these stories and their realities are being held up to emulate. Like, what? This is way too complicated. Like, this makes me very uncomfortable. The topic of slavery in the Newer Testament, much less in early Christianity, is way more complex than most people realize, way more than I did before I started reading this. So it's actually, I'm really excited to get to share some of the, like, try to pull together and succinct kind of, bullet points for everyone. There's more going on here than just slaves obey your masters that happens 3 times in the Newer Testament, which is problematic enough, right? There's more going on than we realize. So I'm excited.
It's gonna be really good. And I love that you use the word Older Testament and Newer Testament.
I use Hebrew Bible and Newer Testament.
Newer Testament. Is the Book of Mormon the New West Testament? Is that
Which Book of Mormon? Because they have an updated. They have an update every year.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
There is a Book of Mormon, but they have constant updates.
And guys, make sure tomorrow you check out. I'm just laughing because I just know that Dr. Kip and I are gonna. It's gonna have a good time. The whiskey's gonna be flowing, and look at that, an Iron Maiden shirt. The very first question, Kip, if you're still here, I want you to start thinking about this. What are your top 5 favorite metal bands? Because I need to talk to you about this. And that's how we'll start off the podcast. So check this out tomorrow. It'll be live as always. I've got a couple more quick questions. This one is from Ken Ham and the Bill Nye debate. This is the one question that seeing how Bill Nye handled it and Ken handled it changed my maybe go, hang on a second, which was what if anything would change your mind? And I guess because well, you're a Christian scholar, but I guess we can talk about, and we haven't talked about this much, but your actual belief in God. So what if anything would change your mind on your belief in God?
Well, I have changed my mind about my belief in God over the years, right? So I had a very fundamentalist, conservative, evangelical way of thinking about that was very closely tied to my upbringing in the church. But I had a very similar, what is that? That's really funny. I had a very biblical impression, right? The way, a very transactional, God is there. I can say I'm sorry to God. God will forgive me. All things are great. And I can talk to God all day and seek God and be open to ideas. And then I went to seminary and I started learning about other ways of thinking about what God is, but all still very human and they very anthropomorphic claims and concepts and attributes, and that this is a relationship, which implies give and take, which implies intentionality on the part of God to me or towards us in general. And most of that is just out the window for me. Most of that is just not there anymore. Intentionality, no. Sorry, no. Okay. God's will. I've been trying not to drop too much language here but I do oh fuck no, no, God's will. No, please stop.
Yeah, right? I hate the concept of God's will.
Right? According to whom? Who's, and just so the closest I come, if I'm going to claim a concept of God, the closest I would come is to a very, very progressive process theology concept. And I say progressive process because a lot of process theology is still giving God a little bit of intention or relationality. And I'm just not there anymore. And so, I go more towards this, I don't know, energy. And actually it's Butler. It's Octavia Butler. She describes God about the best that I've seen. And she describes it as
as what?
Change.
Okay. Interesting.
That is, if you go read her two parable novels, she talks about it there. And that is the closest I've seen a human try to describe and and put words to what is God.
Interesting.
Yeah. They're good reads. They're quick, easy, but also really meaty.
Do you,
novels.
Octavia Butler, what are the books called? Do you remember what they
Parable of the
called?
Sower and Parable of the, I get them
Parable of the Sower.
confused. What there's, Sower and
Parable of the Talents?
Talents. Yes, that's it.
Yes. Okay, cool. So Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
she was amazing. And anyway, so that's the closest I come. Sorry, back to you. What you were saying something else. I just can't say enough. Like, I love that she tried to put it into a novel form and to have like a conversation about what it means and looks like. But I mean, look around you, look at nature. What is the one constant thing about nature? That it is growing and changing. It constantly changes, and it is fierce and intense. And you know what I mean? Like, there's not harsh intentions. It just happens, and it goes, and it grows, and it keeps going. And I don't know.
Have you heard about, I know that you're not a huge fan of Sam Harris, and we can
I mean, I like it. I like his ideas. I just don't like his snark.
Sassiness?
His snark and his disrespectfulness of people that don't think the way he does.
Which is funny because he's like a milk toast version of Richard Dawkins, but
agreed,
or someone like that.
Yeah.
But he talks about this I can't remember which book it was. Maybe it was Waking Up. But he talks about like someone having like a type of an epileptic fit where they needed to cut their brain in half to cut the synapses in half. So there was like the one part of the brain and the other part of the brain, so they weren't connected anymore. Huge fatality risk in this, but it was the only thing that they could do. But what they found, what was super interesting in people who have this surgery, is they can answer with two. Do you know about this? They can answer differently. So they can verbalize an answer and then point to a yes or a no, or spell it out with their hand, and it'll give different answers because one side of the brain is the analytical moving part, and one part of the brain is. And they ask them stuff like, who should be the next president, and all this stuff. And they ask them, do you believe in God? They point to no, and then say yes. And it's wild. That's wild.
That's really cool.
and it's really wild to me. And so there's always a part of me because that I can kind of almost get on board with concepts like that. I'm an agnostic atheist. I don't believe in God. I think that the way that we should arrive at our ideas, I think the best way is through rational thought and critical thinking and all that stuff. And I just haven't had enough evidence to relay my doubts about the existence of a creator. However, in saying that, like if we were having an ayahuasca conversation or smoking a joint in the backyard or something, or around a fire, the concept, like getting into that artful headspace where you can think of God as like change, or you can think of God as like I like the Buddhist analogy of like blind men touching an elephant, and they're all describing this elephant differently. I kind of can resonate a little bit with that. Like it's like there's something there. I don't think it's like morality. I don't think it actually exists, but people are describing this thing in a way that seems to have certain characteristics about it. I've heard this another analogy. It's like Western religions like Christianity, like the Abrahamic religions. It's like they're climbing up to God, right? So it's like I'm needing to turn to Jesus or pray 5 times a day. They're climbing up to God, where Eastern religions are like looking inwards. So it's like looking inwards to yourself, and it's like a different, So it could be something to that, but I don't personally put any weight to any of that.
And I think the external God is out there above us, beyond our comprehension. That I very much do not like that conception of God. I find that very frustrating, and it has led to a lot of de-intellectual realities and just sheep behaviors.
Like the deist perspective almost. Do you not like the deist perspective of God? Like,
it isn't that I don't like it, but I find that more appropriate than saying that God is out there and God's ways are beyond ours, because that makes me want to say fuck you. Because no, I do like, it's also the same thing like with, that God is outside of us and we need God. I'm like, no, guess what? Actually, God is already within you. If you're going to talk about a God, like it's already there for you to tap into, as compared to this this, you are scum and crap and you need God and Jesus. Like that just, I had a year of stepping in as an associate pastor at a Presbyterian church. And so I did the call to confession and the assurance of pardon for a year. And that was what did it for me. I was like, no, I do not want to keep telling people they are sinful pieces of shit that need this thing. No, I'm done with that. Like, no, because it's language is powerful.
Yeah. There's that Volker Greville poem from the 16th century, I think it was, at the start of, it's a Christian poem, I think, but it was at the start of God Is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens. And he said, it's, oh, wearisome condition of humanity. But anyway, the main part is, oh, wearisome condition of humanity, created sick, commanded to be sound. And it's like the idea that we're born sinners, but we're commanded to be sound through Jesus. And it's like there's something brutal about that, harsh. And it kind of paints this.
Really?
Yeah, it paints God to be like a mafia boss or something.
Totally.
And
there are a lot of things.
No. So
I mean, there's just so many things about the depiction of God. That I see a lot of atheists reacting to. And so that's part of why I have this thing about, I think we need to redefine God, or just be very clear that when you say that you're an atheist, what you actually are saying to me is you don't believe in that thing that people are talking about over there.
Yeah.
And I think that's sound. I think that's respectful, like respectable and reasonable.
I actually like to defend God on this channel. So like I say like, you're telling me that God wanted people to enslave other people, that he genocided other nations.
Right.
And I'm saying, stop teasing God. It's not okay, right? Like the creator of the universe wouldn't do that if one did exist. It's funny. I throw it on his head. We have a super chat from Cheryl again. Check out Dr. Bird's
Cheryl,
podcast.
you are such a love.
It's excellent. I'll have to check it out. I haven't listened to it yet.
Let me briefly just explain. Wild Olive is our tagline is game-changing conversation about literature, culture, and the Bible. And so I've teamed up with a literature professor. Her name's Jean Patrol. She lives in Chicago, Illinois, and or Evanston. But she teaches the Bible as literature, and that's how she found out about my book, Permission Granted. Blah blah blah. So I'm coming as a biblical scholar. She's coming as a literature scholar. We engage primarily poetry because it's easier to do, but we engage poets and novelists. Authors who have engaged a concept from the Bible. And we use that as a way to help to have a conversation about the fact that there's more than one way to read anything in the Bible, but in particular, these really crucial moments that Lot's wife, like there's a really powerful way of reading that story that's different from the one I was given. Right. And so we have a conversation about that. And we talk about, lots of things related to the Bible, but also beyond that into culture and the way biblical tropes or biblical ideas end up in lots of places in our world beyond just religious contexts. And so I think there's something interesting to observe there. And we're trying to keep it around 30 minutes, a 30-minute podcast episode. So yeah,
that's much more reasonable than what I'm putting.
Well, it's a different thing. Yeah. We want people to, so
listen.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you for that plug.
And the last question. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for coming on. And I'll just once again shout out. Go check out the podcast, the book. Please go if you listen to this audiobook. It's good for Christians, definitely, but it's also good for atheists or agnostics to read and get a different perspective on some of these troublesome verses. It's go rate it. Go give it an honest rating. I'm sure you're gonna love it. And obviously check out Dr. Bird's YouTube page here. So the last question. And just last thing I'm not very good at this advertising stuff. I'm sorry. But straight after this, probably 15 minutes after I end this, we're going to be making a live stream, an unlisted private live stream on Deep Drink's Patreon page. So if you are a Patreon supporter, I've seen we've got a few more Patreon supporters since we started this live stream. Thank you so much.
Nice.
You can come over and you can watch it. And for those who, I don't imagine many people will come, but if you do, but you'll be able to watch it later if you decide to join later and see how I create, come up with my questions and do how I do the research for the stuff and kind of a behind the scenes hangout for Deep Drinks. So the last question What advice would you give to a Christian who feels conflicted with what they read in the Bible?
Yeah. I think
Read your book.
I would say that actually, but I would say the things that helped me survive seminary. And so that's these two convictions got me through seminary. The first is I believed that God created us, and that means God created us with the minds that we have. So I believe then that it is okay to use your mind, in particular in pursuits related to your faith, as compared to not, like stop asking questions, right? No, actually, that is honoring to God. If you believe God created you, it is honoring to God that you would use your mind even here. So that's one thing that I think is important. The other is, if God and the Bible cannot handle your questions, then I'm not sure they deserve your devotion.
Ooh, wow. That's a good quote.
Thank
That's a
you.
great quote. I'm very excited to learn more and read your newest book. How long away is it?
It's
you
a few
think?
months away. Yeah, I just
Yeah.
handed over the manuscript, and it takes a few months to kind of pull everything together. So,
Yeah.
unfortunately, but it'll be out in
But
November. That's
awesome.
we have a release date of mid-November at the latest. So
Awesome. Well, I'm gonna have to get a signed copy of that as well because I love your work so far.
Thank you,
Thank you.
David. I appreciate
Thank you
that.
so much, Jennifer. And thank you for coming on. And guys, make sure you check out the panel that's coming up. Jennifer is going to be amazing on that, as well as everyone else.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for having me.
See ya. Bye.